7 bids, every one of them from the same group of men standing in a loose semicircle near the auctioneer's wagon. The opening number was $40 for 300 acres with a working well, a fenced pasture, and a barn that had been raised by one man's hands over 30 consecutive seasons. $40, the price of a decent saddle. Ada Whitfield stood in the second row of onlookers, with her husband's leather ledger pressed against her sternum, and she did not blink when the auctioneer called for higher bids because she already knew none were coming. Cole Whitmore stood closest to the auctioneer's platform, with his arms folded across a chest that strained the seams of a canvas duster. His flat-brimmed hat cast a shadow over a face that had gone soft in the jowls from years of whiskey and easy work. His tobacco-stained fingers rested on his belt buckle, like a man watching a horse race he had already bet on. Behind him, 4 more men in similar dress waited with their hands at their sides, not bidding, not needing to. They were the only people in Caldwell Flats with their money out. Sheriff Edmund Crail watched from the boardwalk across the street. He leaned against a post with one boot crossed over the other, his silver star catching a bar of late-morning light that cut between the awnings. His vest was pressed, his collar was buttoned. He had the posture of a man who had organized every element of the afternoon and was now simply watching the machinery perform its function. He did not need to bid. He did not need to speak. He had signed the foreclosure order 3 weeks ago, and the document in the auctioneer's hand bore his seal, his signature, and a date that corresponded to a tax lien that had been manufactured in his office on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The crowd on the street numbered perhaps 60. Shopkeepers, homesteaders, women with baskets on their arms who had stopped moving when the auctioneer's voice carried across the dust. They watched Ada Whitfield the way people watch a funeral procession, with the specific discomfort of witnesses who understand that their presence is an obligation they have not fulfilled. Her ranch sat 4 miles south of town, on land her husband Abel had claimed 28 years ago when there was nothing there but dry grass and a creek that ran 3 months of the year. He had built the fence posts from cottonwood he cut himself. He had dug the well by hand with a shovel and a rope and the kind of stubbornness that does not announce itself. He had died in November, quietly, in the bed he had built from the same cottonwood, and Ada had buried him on the hill behind the house where he could see the creek from every season. The tax lien said she owed $412 in back assessments. The real number, the one that existed in the ledger she held against her chest, was $14.30. A discrepancy in the water rights assessment that had been paid in full the previous spring. Abel had kept every receipt, every transaction, every stub. His handwriting was precise, deliberate, the hand of a man who understood that paper would matter more than memory. It had not mattered. The auctioneer, a man named Pruitt, whom Crail had hired from Santa Fe, because no one in Caldwell Flats would have agreed to do what needed doing, called for bids one final time. His voice carried the particular cadence of someone performing a ritual he had performed enough times to be bored by it. Going once at $40. Going twice. Cole Whitmore adjusted his hat. The brim threw a shadow across his eyes. Sold. To the gentleman for $40. The number landed in the dust of the street with the specific weight of a sentence pronounced by a judge who has already been paid. $40 for a ranch that was worth, by any honest measure, more than $2,000. Ada Whitfield did not move. She stood with the ledger against her chest and looked at the auctioneer's wagon, the way a person looks at a gravestone. Not with surprise, but with the quiet recognition that what she had feared had arrived. The crowd began to disperse. Not quickly. Not in a rush. In the slow, careful way of people who have just watched something they know was wrong and are now negotiating with themselves about whether they are the kind of person who saw it and did nothing, or the kind who will do something later, in private, where it does not cost them anything. A woman touched Ada's arm as she passed. A brief contact, not quite a squeeze. The gesture of someone offering comfort they know is insufficient. Sheriff Crail pushed off the post and walked south along the boardwalk, his boots making the particular sound of authority on wood. Unhurried, measured, the stride of a man whose day was going exactly as planned. At the back of the thinning crowd, a man leaned against the last post at the edge of the hitching rail. He had arrived that morning on a dark brown horse, and he had not spoken to anyone. He wore a light beige hat, a dark gray vest, and a red bandana knotted at his throat that caught the light when he turned his head. His rifle was in the scabbard on the saddle, and his horse stood quiet beside him, its ears moving with the specific attentiveness of an animal that has been in enough uncertain places to know when something is wrong. He had watched the entire auction. He had not moved. He had counted the bidders, noted which direction they looked when the auctioneer called the numbers, observed the specific moment when Ada Whitfield's shoulders shifted, not in defeat, but in the recognition of something she had already accepted. He had also noticed something the crowd had not. The foreclosure document that Pruitt held up for display bore Crail's seal, but the date on the tax lien, the foundation of the entire proceeding, was 6 weeks after the county records office had confirmed Ada's payment in full. He knew this because he had walked to the registry office that morning before the auction began, asked the clerk to see the county tax rolls for the Whitfield parcel, and watched the clerk's left hand move to cover the bottom of the page. That hand had told him everything. The crowd was nearly gone now. Cole Whitmore and his men were already walking toward the saloon, their boots loud and confident, the sound of men who believe the work is done. Pruitt was folding his documents into a leather case. Ada Whitfield stood where she had stood for the last hour, alone now, the ledger still against her chest. The stranger untied his horse from the hitching rail. He did not walk toward Ada Whitfield. He did not walk toward the saloon. He walked toward the sheriff's office, leading the horse by the reins, with the specific, unhurried pace of a man who has already decided what comes next and sees no reason to rush the geography. The horse's ears fixed on the sheriff's office window as they crossed the street. He tied the horse to the rail outside the sheriff's office with a patient knot, the kind of knot a man ties when he is not planning to leave soon. He looked at the building for a long moment. Then he stepped inside. Deputy Joseph Watt was sitting behind the front desk. He had a pen in his hand and a ledger open in front of him. And when the stranger walked in, he looked up with the specific wariness of a man who has been expecting a visitor he did not invite. "I'm looking for the statute," the stranger said, "that authorizes the assessment on the Whitfield property." Watt's pen stopped moving. Outside, Ada Whitfield began walking home, carrying her husband's ledger and the weight of a transaction that 60 people had watched and no one had interrupted. The road south was long, and the dust rose around her boots with each step, and the sun was high enough that her shadow was short, the specific shape of a person carrying something they refused to set down. The stranger looked at the building for a long moment. Then he stepped inside. Deputy Joseph Watt was sitting behind the front desk. He had a pen in his hand and a ledger open in front of him, and when the stranger walked in, he looked up with the specific wariness of a man who has been expecting a visitor he did not invite. "I'm looking for the statute," the stranger said, "that authorizes the assessment on the Whitfield property." Watt's pen stopped moving. Not quickly. It decelerated the way a wheel decelerates, when the wagon it's attached to reaches the top of a grade and there is, for one suspended moment, no reason for it to keep turning. He set the pen down beside the ledger with a care that suggested he had been thinking about this pen and this ledger and the relationship between them for a longer time than most men think about anything. "Which assessment?" Watt said. His voice was flat, not hostile, not helpful, the voice of a man who has been asked a question that might save his life or end it, and has not yet decided which. The one on the foreclosure order. The one the auctioneer read this morning. The one that put a 300-acre working ranch on the block for $40. The stranger was still standing in the doorway. He had not removed his hat. He had not sat down. He was reading the room the way a man reads a ledger, not for what is written on the surface, but for what is missing. I'd like to see the statute that authorizes a county seizure at that valuation. Watt leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked with a sound that was not the sound of weight shifting, but of a decision being considered. He looked at the stranger for a long moment, and then he did something that a man in his position, a deputy in a town where the sheriff owned the law, should not have done. He looked at the ledger on his desk, and then he looked at the stranger again, and then he looked at the ledger one more time. "Sit down," Watt said. The stranger did not sit. He walked to the desk and placed both hands flat on the surface, not aggressively, not as a threat, but as a statement of positioning. He was close enough now to see what Watt had been writing, the columns, the dates, the names. He read the top entry without asking permission. Caldwell Feed and Supply, $12 monthly. Assessed under what authority? County Ordinance 17, Watt said. His voice had changed. It was quieter now, and there was something in it that the stranger recognized. The sound of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just felt the first suggestion that he might be allowed to set it down. County Ordinance 17 doesn't authorize monthly collection on a private business. It authorizes a one-time assessment for road maintenance, written in 1871. Renewed once in 1874, expired. The stranger said this the way a man states the temperature. So who authorized the continuing collection? Watt's hand moved, involuntarily, unconsciously, to the edge of the desk drawer on his left side. It was the smallest movement, a shift of 3 inches, but the stranger's eyes tracked it with the specific precision of a man who reads gestures the way other men read words. "There's another ledger," Watt said. "I know," the stranger said. The silence that followed was not the silence of two men who have nothing to say. It was the silence of two men who have arrived at the edge of a conversation that, once it begins, cannot be taken back. Watt looked at the door. He looked at the window. He looked at the stranger's hands, which had not moved from the desk, and then at the stranger's eyes, which had not moved from Watt's face. "In the drawer," Watt said. "I know," the stranger said again. Watt opened the drawer. Inside was a Bible, a thick, leather-bound King James with gilt edges that had been worn smooth by years of handling. But it was not a Bible the way a Bible is meant to be used. The center pages had been cut, precisely, carefully, with a razor, to create a hollow. And inside the hollow was a second ledger, smaller than the one on the desk. Brown leather cover, no markings. The edges of the pages were darkened by the oils of a hand that had opened and closed this book hundreds of times without ever reading a single printed word inside the binding that concealed it. Watt set it on the desk between them. 2 years, he said. Every illegal seizure, every fraudulent tax lien, every auction where the same 4 men bid against each other to keep the price below $100. Every payment that went to the same box at the Wells Fargo office, addressed to a name I've never heard spoken aloud in this building. He paused. I wrote it all down. The stranger opened the ledger. He did not rush. He turned the pages with the same unhurried attention he had given to the room when he entered, reading what was there and, more importantly, what was not. The entries were meticulous. Dates, names, amounts, the original assessed value of each property versus the seizure price. The gap between what a ranch was worth and what it sold for at Rook's auctions was not a gap. It was a canyon. 22 properties, the stranger said. 22 that I documented. There were others before I started keeping count. Who gets the money? Watt's jaw tightened, not in anger, in the specific expression of a man who has spent 2 years answering that question for himself and has never been able to say it to another person. It goes to a box at the Wells Fargo office. Every month, the box is registered to a company called the Territorial Land and Development Corporation. I've never seen the man who picks up the money, but I've seen the sheriff write the receipts. The stranger turned another page. The column headers were precise. Date of seizure, property, original owner, seizure price, market value, transfer recipient. The last column was always the same 3 initials. TLDC. "This company," the stranger said, "is it chartered in the territory?" "I don't know. I only know the name and the box number." The stranger closed the ledger. He held it in both hands for a moment, feeling its weight. Not the physical weight, which was slight, but the accumulated weight of 2 years of a man's patience, compressed into the space between 2 leather covers. "The statute I referenced when I walked in," the stranger said. "The one that doesn't authorize what Rook has been doing. Do you know which one does?" Watt shook his head. "The 1862 Homestead Act, Section 4. Any county seizure of homestead property requires a federal review when the seizure price falls below 20% of assessed value. Every one of these sales falls below that threshold. Every one. Which means every seizure Rook has conducted for the last 2 years is subject to federal review, and was subject to federal review the entire time." He set the Bible cover ledger on the desk. The sheriff built a house on a foundation he didn't check. Watt stared at the ledger. His hands were flat on the desk now, mirroring the stranger's posture from minutes before, as if the posture itself had been passed across the surface, like a document being transferred. "I kept that ledger," Watt said slowly, "because I knew someone would need it. I didn't know what they'd do with it." "You don't need to know," the stranger said. "The statute does the work. I'm just the man carrying it to where it can be read." He picked up the ledger. He did not ask permission. Watt did not object. There was, in that exchange, the specific quality of a transaction that both parties have been waiting 2 years to complete. Not the transaction of money or goods, but the transaction of responsibility. The ledger left Watt's hands and entered the stranger's, and something in Watt's posture changed. Not all at once, in stages, the way a building settles when a load is removed from its upper floor. The stranger walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "The box at Wells Fargo, is it still active?" "Last collection was Tuesday." "Who collects?" "I've never seen his face. Only his boots. Fancy boots, the kind a man buys when he's spending other people's money." The stranger nodded once and stepped outside. The sun had moved. It was late afternoon now, and the shadows of the false front buildings stretched across the main street of Caldwell Flats like dark fingers reaching for the other side. The town had returned to its rhythms. The general store was open. The blacksmith's hammer rang from 2 streets over. A dog slept in the dust near the water trough. Everything looked normal. Everything was normal. That was the specific horror of what Rook had built. A system of theft so regular, so embedded in the calendar and the routine, that the town had stopped recognizing it as theft. The stranger stood on the boardwalk and looked south, the direction Ada Whitfield had walked. The road was empty now. The dust had settled, but he could see where her boots had left marks in the soft shoulder. A steady, even stride, the stride of a woman who had walked this road every day for 30 years and was not about to stop walking it, because a man with a badge and a rigged auctioneer had told her the road was no longer hers. He walked to the livery stable. His horse was where he had left it, tied with that patient knot, standing in the shade of the overhang, its ears tracking the sounds of the town with the specific attentiveness of an animal that has learned to listen for things its rider will need to know. The stranger rested his hand on the horse's neck for a moment. The horse did not flinch. It knew this hand. It knew the weight of it meant something different than the weight of a stranger's hand. "There's more work tonight," the stranger said to the horse quietly, the way a man speaks to the only creature in a town that has not yet proven itself untrustworthy. He checked the cinch. He adjusted the bridle. He did not mount. Not yet. He stood beside the horse and watched the street, and the horse watched with him, and between them there was the specific partnership of two beings who have traveled far enough together to communicate without language. Cole Whitmore was at the far end of the boardwalk, outside the saloon. He was talking to two men, both thick through the shoulders, both wearing the same kind of dull-colored vests that marked them as employees rather than civilians. Whitmore had a cigar in his mouth, and he was looking toward the livery with the expression of a man who has just been told that something in his territory has changed and has not yet decided how much it matters. The stranger looked at Whitmore. Whitmore looked at the stranger. Neither moved, neither needed to. The recognition between them was not personal. It was professional. Two men who understood the geometry of a problem and were at that moment calculating angles. The stranger turned back to his horse. He untied the patient knot, retied it. The same knot, the same patience. Ada Whitfield was 3 miles south now, walking toward a ranch that the law said was no longer hers, carrying a ledger that held 30 years of her husband's handwriting. And the stranger was standing in a stable in a town where the sheriff owned the courthouse and the auction block, and the silence of every person who had watched that morning's transaction and said nothing. The knot held. The horse waited. The stranger had what he needed. Now he needed the man behind the badge. The stranger did not leave the stable at sundown. He remained in the hayloft, sitting against the far wall where the roof beams met the supporting post, his rifle across his knees, his hat tipped forward just enough to shade his eyes without restricting his line of sight through the loft's open shutter. The stable belonged to a man named Garvey, who owed the sheriff 4 months of payments on a livery license that had cost $11 a year before Rook took office, and now cost $40. Garvey had said nothing when the stranger asked to leave his horse there overnight. He had simply handed over the loft key and gone back to his quarters with the specific gait of a man who has learned that accommodating strangers is safer than questioning them. From the loft, the stranger could see both approaches to the stable. The main door faced the street, wide enough for a wagon, barred from inside with an oak beam that fit into iron brackets set into the doorframe. The second opening was a window on the east wall, shoulder width, overlooking the alley that ran between the stable and the undertaker's workshop. That alley was narrow, too narrow for two men to stand abreast comfortably, which meant anyone entering through that window would come one at a time, which meant the geometry favored a single defender with a clear field of fire and the elevation advantage of 8 feet above the floor. He had studied these angles since morning, not because he expected trouble that specific night, but because a man who identifies the dimensions of a room before he enters it is a man who has survived rooms where other men did not. The town of Caldwell Flats settled into its evening posture with the specific slowness of a community that has learned to be indoors by dark. Oil lamps bloomed in windows along the main street. The saloon at the corner of 2nd and Broad, Rook's Saloon, though the deed was registered under his sister's name, discharged its last afternoon patrons around 7. 2 of them walked past the stable, boots scraping gravel, their conversation a low murmur about nothing consequential. The stranger listened to their voices fade. At 8, the street was quiet. Not empty. A town is never truly empty, but quiet in the way that matters. The sounds that remained were domestic. a screen door closing somewhere to the north, the distant complaint of a horse that hadn't been fed on time, the thin whistle of wind finding the gaps between buildings. These were the sounds a man uses as a baseline. When something new enters the pattern, the baseline tells him. Something new entered the pattern at 8:15. 3 sets of boots, not walking together. That was the first tell. Walking in a spread formation, which meant they had discussed approach angles before reaching the stable, which meant this was not a casual visit. The first set came from the street side, slow and deliberate, boot heels grinding into the gravel with the weight of a man who wants to be heard approaching but not rushing. The second came from the east, the alley, lighter, quicker, a younger man's gait or a smaller man's. Someone who expected to arrive at the window before the front door situation resolved. The third was the slowest, staying back, positioned at the corner of the building where the alley met the street. A sentry, someone whose job was not to enter, but to ensure no one left. The stranger did not move. He had already counted to 4 in his mind before the first boot stopped at the stable door. 4 possible outcomes depending on what happened in the next 30 seconds. If the front man tried the door and found it barred and left, it was a warning, a message that they knew where he was. If he tried the door and called out, it was an invitation to negotiate on their terms. If the alley man reached the window first and attempted entry, it was a kill attempt. If both moved simultaneously, it was a coordinated assault, which meant someone with tactical experience had planned it. The front man tried the door. It held. He did not call out. Instead, he made a sound, 3 short knocks, then 2 slow ones. A signal. From the alley, the window shutter creaked. The stranger raised the rifle, sighting along the barrel at the window opening, and waited. The geometry was exactly as he had calculated. The man climbing through the window would be silhouetted against the last light reflecting off the undertaker's workshop roof. Visible, disoriented by the transition from moonlight to darkness inside the stable, and unable to bring a weapon to bear until both hands were free of the window frame. The head appeared first. Flat-brimmed hat, no, a round crown, younger, which told him this was not Whitmore. This was one of the collection deputies. The man's right hand gripped the window frame, while his left hand held a drawn pistol, which meant he was left-handed, which meant his primary weapon was committed to the entry, and his line of fire would arc from left to right as he came through. The stranger fired once. Not at the man, at the frame, 6 inches from the man's grip. The bullet splintered the wood and threw a spray of fragments that drove the man backward with a sharp cry. Not from a wound, but from the reflex of a creature that has just had its world interrupted by something louder and faster than it expected. The man fell from the window onto the alley ground. The sound of his landing, a heavy, graceless thud, carried clearly in the evening air. The front door shuddered. Someone had thrown a shoulder against it. The oak beam held. The iron brackets groaned but did not give. The stranger moved from his position along the wall to the center of the loft, where the floor was reinforced to bear the weight of stored hay bales and would not creak under a man's weight. He shifted his angle to cover both the window and the loft's internal ladder access, which led down to the stable floor and the main door. If the front man found another way in, through the horse stalls, through a side panel, he would have to come up the ladder. The ladder was narrow, 1 man at a time. The geometry had not changed. A voice from outside, not the alley man, the sentry at the corner. "He's in the loft." A pause, then a different voice, deeper, more practiced, the kind of voice that gives orders because it has been giving orders for a long time and has stopped questioning whether the orders are sound. "The window is no good. Go around. Both of you come through the stalls." The stranger tracked the sound. The sentry was moving from the corner toward the main door, where the first man was still stationed. Two men now at the front. The alley man, the one who had tested the window, was circling to join them, which meant the alley was temporarily clear, which meant nothing because the stranger had no intention of leaving through the alley. His intention was to remain exactly where he was. The main door scraped, not the oak beam giving way. A different sound, the sound of a man sliding a knife or a flat bar into the gap between the door and the frame, probing for the beam's position. The stranger could see the door from above. The blade of a large knife appeared in the gap, angled upward, searching. If the man found the beam and had leverage, he could work it loose from the brackets, given enough time and enough motivation. The stranger fired again, this time at the door itself, through the wood, 2 inches above the gap where the knife blade was probing. The knife disappeared. A curse from outside, sharp and immediate, followed by the sound of a man stumbling backward. Not hit. The bullet had passed through the door and struck the hitching post beyond, but startled enough to lose his footing on the gravel. "Rifle!" said the deep voice. The voice of the man in charge, not panicked, recalculating. "He's got the loft and a rifle. We can't come through the door." Silence for a moment. The specific kind of silence that happens when men who expected to be the predators realize the arrangement has inverted, and they are now functionally pinned against a building by a single man they cannot see. The deep voice came again, closer now from the side of the building. The speaker had moved to put the wall between himself and the stranger's line of fire. Smart, professional. "You in the loft. Sheriff wants to talk, that's all. You come down, we walk to the office, and this stays polite." The stranger did not answer. "Nobody has to get hurt here," the voice continued, the specific cadence of a man who has said those words before and means the opposite. "The sheriff's a reasonable man. You got questions, he's got answers. But you sitting up there with a rifle makes this a different conversation." The stranger spoke. His voice was flat, unhurried, the tone of a man reading a number from a ledger. "How many seizures has the sheriff processed in the last 2 years?" Silence. "How many properties has he transferred to the Territorial Land and Development Corporation?" The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before. Before, the men outside were waiting for tactical instructions. Now they were waiting, because the question had introduced a variable they were not authorized to address. The stranger had identified the specific boundary of their authority. They could intimidate, they could threaten, they could break a man's body in an alley and call it resistance. But they could not discuss the name of the company, because the name of the company was the one thing that connected the sheriff's badge to the money, and the men outside had been hired to enforce, not to understand. "We don't know what you're talking about," the deep voice said, too quickly. "Yes," the stranger said. "You do." Another pause, longer this time. The stranger could hear them breathing, the heavy, deliberate breaths of men who are standing still and thinking and not liking the direction of their thoughts. Then the deep voice returned, lower now, stripped of the false civility. "Last chance. Come down, or we burn the stable and you with it." This was the moment the stranger had been waiting for. Not the threat. The threat was predictable. The last resort of a man whose tactical options have narrowed to arson, which is the confession of a man who cannot win a fair exchange. What the stranger was waiting for was the confirmation. These men were operating under orders that permitted destruction of civilian property, which meant the orders came from a man who believed his badge insulated him from consequences, which meant the man behind the badge had never encountered a counter-authority that superseded his own. "You'll want to reconsider that," the stranger said. "Garvey's stable has a livery license filed with the Territorial Commerce Office. Burning it is not a county matter. It's a federal one." He did not know whether this was strictly true. the livery license detail he had invented. Garvey's license was county-issued and fell entirely under Rook's jurisdiction. But the men outside did not know that, and the word federal, introduced into a conversation built entirely on county authority, had the specific effect he intended. It introduced doubt, not about the stable, about whether burning it would protect them or expose them. The deep voice did not respond for 11 seconds. The stranger counted. Then, "We're leaving, but this isn't finished." Bootsteps, moving away. The formation was different now. They moved in a cluster, not a spread, huddled together for the specific comfort of proximity when the world has not gone as planned. The stranger tracked their footsteps until they faded into the general silence of the town's evening. He did not come down from the loft. 20 minutes later, a new sound. A single set of footsteps approaching the stable from the south, not the direction the deputies had gone. These steps were measured, careful, the walk of a man who does not want to surprise anyone. A shape appeared at the main door. A knock. Ordinary this time, no code. "It's what?" said a quiet voice through the wood. "I have something you'll want to see, and I don't think it should wait until morning." The stranger descended the ladder. He lifted the oak beam from the brackets and opened the door. Joseph Watt stood in the moonlight holding what appeared to be a Bible. Black leather cover, gold-embossed cross on the front. But the weight was wrong for a Bible. The stranger could see that from the way Watt held it. Two-handed, close to his body, the way a man carries something he has been guarding for a long time and is about to hand to someone else. "It's all here," Watt said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "Every seizure, every auction, every transfer. The dates, the names, the amounts, what the properties were worth and what they sold for. All of it, going back 2 years and 3 months. The stranger took the Bible. It was heavier than it looked. He opened the cover and saw, beneath the first page of scripture, a different kind of accounting. Columns of figures in Watt's careful hand. Each entry dated, each property described with a specificity that suggested the writer had stood in each location and recorded what he saw. The entries ran for pages. "Why now?" the stranger asked. Watt looked at the street behind him. Empty. Quiet. "Because 3 men just tried to burn a stable to get to one person who asked one question. And that question was about the Whitfield ranch." He paused. "I've been waiting 2 years for someone to ask that question. I didn't think it would take a stranger." The stranger closed the Bible. The weight of it, the ledger inside, was the specific weight of a thing that changes the geometry of every room it enters. He looked at Watt for a long moment. Then he said, "Where does the sheriff keep his copies?" Watt understood the question. "His office safe. He thinks no one knows the combination." "Do you?" Watt's answer was not verbal. It was a small, precise nod. The kind a man gives when he has spent 2 years learning a thing he never expected to need and is at last offering it to someone who will know what to do with it. The stranger put the Bible inside his coat. He stepped back into the stable and rebarred the door. Then he climbed the ladder to the loft and sat against the far wall again, his rifle across his knees, the ledger pressing against his ribs beneath the coat. The night was not over, but the ground had shifted. The men who had come to discourage him had instead delivered the final piece of information he needed. The sheriff was willing to burn to protect what he had built, which meant what he had built was worth more than one ranch, more than one auction, more than one deputy's silence. It meant there was a structure, a machine, and the machine required fuel in the form of other people's land, and the machine's engine was a silver star pinned to a pressed vest in a courthouse, 2 blocks east. The stranger sat in the dark and listened to the town breathe and calculated what the morning would require. The horse shifted in its stall below, not restless, alert. Its ears had been fixed on the main door since the footsteps began. The horse had known before the stranger did that visitors were coming, and it had not settled since they left, which meant something else was still moving in the darkness beyond the stable walls. The stranger trusted the horse. The horse trusted the night. Between them, they would wait until morning. The morning arrived without color. A gray sky over Caldwell Flats, the kind that flattens shadows and makes every building look like it was built from ash. The stranger descended from the hayloft before the first light hit the street, his boots finding the ladder rungs by memory, his rifle slung over one shoulder, and the Bible, Joseph Watt's ledger, hidden inside its cracked leather cover, tucked into the inner pocket of his vest, pressed flat against his ribs where it had slept while he sat watch through the hours the horse would not settle. He fed the horse. He checked the cinch. He poured water into the trough from the barrel Garvey kept by the door and waited until the animal drank before he stepped into the street. The town was different in the early hour. Quieter, but it was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of a place that has learned to hold its breath between the moments when the man with the badge decides to move. The general store's owner was sweeping his porch but not looking up. A woman crossed the street, carrying a basket, and walked faster than the basket required. Two men stood outside the feed mill, not talking, just standing with their hands in their pockets, watching the courthouse the way a dog watches the hand that has struck it before. The stranger walked east. He did not go to the sheriff's office. He went to the telegraph station. The operator was a young man, barely 20, with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose and the specific pallor of someone who spends his days inside a room with no windows. He looked up when the stranger entered, and his eyes moved immediately to the red bandana, then to the rifle, then to the stranger's face. And, in that sequence, there was a calculation that resolved into something that was not quite fear and not quite respect, but a third thing, recognition that this man did not belong to the ordinary machinery of the town. "I need to send a wire," the stranger said. "To where?" "Cheyenne." The operator's hand hovered over his key. "The sheriff reviews all outgoing wires." "I know." The operator looked at him for a long 3 seconds. Then he pulled a blank form from the stack and set it on the counter, face up, and slid a pencil across to the stranger without another word. The stranger wrote. The message was brief. It named the Territorial Land and Development Corporation. It cited a specific section of the Federal Territorial Statute of 1862, the provision that governed county-level seizure authority, and its limitations when exercised against homestead claims filed prior to territorial incorporation. It requested confirmation of the corporation's federal charter status and its compliance with the accounting requirements that the statute imposed as a condition of continued validity. It was signed with no name, only a reference number that the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne would recognize as belonging to an active review file. He paid the fee. Exact change. "The wire to Cheyenne goes through the relay at Laramie," the operator said. "It'll be 3 hours before it reaches the land office." "That's fine." The stranger stepped back into the street. 3 hours. The morning stage from the east was due at 11. He had heard the stableman mention it the night before while feeding the horses. The territorial marshal's quarterly circuit brought him through Caldwell Flats on the morning stage, which meant the man would arrive with the dust still on his coat and the schedule still in his hand, and he would walk into a town where the sheriff had prepared the courthouse the way a theater owner prepares a stage. Everything clean, everything correct, everything a lie. The stranger had 3 hours. He did not intend to spend them waiting. He walked to Ada Whitfield's ranch, 4 miles south, the same road she had walked alone the afternoon before, carrying the ledger against her chest. The stranger covered the distance at a steady pace, his horse moving at a walk that ate ground without hurry, the same pace a man uses when he knows exactly where he is going and what he will find when he arrives. The land on both sides was good land, deep soil, established fencing, the kind of property that takes decades to build from raw prairie into something that produces. Abel Whitfield had spent 28 years doing that work. The stranger could see it in the fence posts, each one set by hand, the kind of hole digging that destroys a man's back by the time he's 50. He could see it in the alignment of the rows where the winter wheat had been planted and harvested and replanted, season after season, until the rows were as straight as a surveyor's line, but made by a man who had never held a surveyor's tools, only a hoe and a will that did not quit. The ranch house sat at the end of the road like a sentence that had been interrupted. Smoke from the chimney. A horse in the corral, not the stranger's kind of horse. A working animal, patient, sway-backed, the kind that pulls a plow and never complains about it. The door was open, not because Ada Whitfield was expecting anyone, because a woman who has been robbed of everything by a man with a badge stops closing doors. There is nothing left to protect. She was sitting at the kitchen table when he appeared in the doorway. Her husband's ledger was open in front of her, and she had been reading it, not searching for anything, just reading, the way a person reads a letter from someone they will never see again. Her hands were still, her eyes were dry. She had passed through the stage of crying sometime in the night and arrived at a place beyond it, a plateau of exhaustion that masquerades as calm. "I know who you are," she said, before he spoke. "You were at the back of the auction." He stepped inside, set his hat on the table, brim down, sat across from her without being invited, because the time for invitations had passed. "The territorial statute of 1862, he said, the section governing county seizure authority. When your husband filed this land under the Homestead Act, did he receive a territorial patent or a county patent?" She looked at him, not with confusion, with the specific attention of a woman who has spent 30 years keeping the books for a ranch and knows exactly what her husband's documents say. "Territorial," she said. "He filed it in 1859, before the county was even incorporated." "That's the answer." He stood, placed his hat back on his head, looked at her once, not with pity, not with admiration, but with the flat acknowledgement of a professional examining a tool that will serve its purpose. "Your husband's patent predates the county's seizure authority by 3 years. Under federal statute, a territorial patent cannot be voided by a county tax lien. It can only be voided by a federal land commissioner's ruling. Sheriff Rook doesn't have that authority. He never did." She stared at him. The ledger was still open on the table, Abel Whitfield's handwriting filling the columns. 30 years of entries. Every calf born, every payment made, every seed purchased, every fence repaired. A life reduced to numbers in a hand that would write no more. "He sold my ranch for $40, she said. "I know." Abel paid $312 for the patent. Over 28 years he put more than $6,000 into the land. More if you count his labor. The stranger said nothing. There was nothing to add to arithmetic that complete. "The real debt," she said. "Rook said we owed $412. Show me the last payment entry." She turned the ledger to the final page. The last entry was dated 11 weeks before Abel's death. $14.30, paid to the county tax office, receipt number 4471. "That's the real debt," the stranger said. $14.30. Paid in full. The receipt number confirms the county received it. Rook's lien claims that payment was never made. Ada Whitfield closed the ledger. Her hands did not shake. They had done their shaking the night before, alone, in a house that the law now said belonged to a man named Cole Whitmore, who had never set a fence post in his life. "I'm going back to town," the stranger said. "The territorial marshal arrives on the 11 o'clock stage. I need that ledger." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pushed the ledger across the table. "It's not mine to keep anymore," she said. "It's Abel's, and Abel would have given it to anyone who could make it count. The stranger took the ledger. He did not thank her, because thanking a woman for the record of her husband's life felt like reducing it to a transaction, and this was not a transaction. It was evidence. It was 30 years of a man's work held in the hands of the person who would know what to do with it. He rode back to town. The stage arrived at 11. It came in from the east the way stages do, a cloud of dust, the specific rhythm of hooves that have been running for 6 hours. The brake shriek as the driver pulled up in front of the Wells Fargo office. 4 passengers descended. The first was a woman with a trunk. The second was a salesman with sample cases. The third was a drummer with a guitar. The fourth was the territorial marshal. He was a tall man, older than the stranger by a decade, with a gray mustache that hung past the corners of his mouth, and the particular posture of a man who has spent 20 years enforcing laws in territories where the law is whatever the nearest man with a gun says it is. He carried no visible weapon. He did not need to. The authority he carried was not the kind that came from a holster. It came from the commission folded inside his coat pocket, signed by the governor of the territory. Valid across every county, every township, every incorporated and unincorporated inch of land between the Missouri and the Rockies. His name was Marshal Gideon Harwell. He was on his quarterly circuit. He had a list of 6 stops, and Caldwell Flats was the 4th. He did not know, yet, that this stop would consume his entire afternoon. The stranger was waiting at the hitching rail outside the Wells Fargo office. He had positioned himself where the marshal would see him immediately upon stepping down from the stage, and where the angle of the building's overhang would keep him out of the sight line from the sheriff's office, which was 2 blocks east and around a corner. Marshal Harwell noticed the stranger the way a professional notices another professional. Not with alarm, but with the awareness that the man leaning against the rail was not leaning idly. His posture was chosen, his placement was specific, and the horse tied beside him was saddled for riding, not for show. The stranger stepped forward. "Marshal Harwell, that's my name. I have a document I need you to read before you check in at the sheriff's office." Harwell's eyes narrowed. Not in suspicion, but in the particular interest of a man who has been doing his job long enough to know that a sentence like that, delivered with that kind of precision, means something worth reading. "Who are you?" "A concerned party." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." Harwell looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the Bible in the stranger's hand, the cracked leather cover, the thin profile, the way the stranger held it at his side as though it were heavier than it appeared. "Let me see it." The stranger handed him the Bible. Harwell opened it. Inside, where the pages of scripture had been carefully hollowed out and replaced, lay Joseph Watt's ledger. 2 years of entries, every illegal seizure, every fraudulent lien, every rigged auction, documented in a deputy's careful hand, with dates, amounts, names, and a column header that repeated 3 initials on every transfer line. TLDC. Harwell read the first page. His jaw tightened, not dramatically, but in the specific way a man's muscles engage when his mind has already understood the implications and his body is catching up. He turned to the second page, the third, the fourth. "This is 2 years of entries," he said. "Yes. Every seizure, every auction, every transfer. Documented. Every one." Harwell closed the ledger. He looked at the courthouse, 2 blocks east. He looked at the stranger. "Who compiled this?" "Deputy Joseph Watt. 2 years of observation, 2 years of documentation. He's been waiting for someone with the jurisdiction to use it." "The jurisdiction," Harwell repeated. He said it the way a man repeats a word when he is testing its weight. "You understand that Sheriff Rook holds an elected county office. My authority as territorial marshal supersedes his on criminal matters, but he will invoke his commission. I know what he'll invoke. I also know what he can't invoke." The stranger reached into his vest pocket and produced a second document, a single sheet of paper, folded twice, bearing the stamped letterhead of the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne. It was the reply to the wire he had sent that morning. It had arrived faster than the operator predicted, not by telegraph, but by rider, a federal courier who had been in the Laramie relay station when the wire came through and recognized the reference number. Harwell read it. The Territorial Land and Development Corporation's federal charter, the entity behind every fraudulent transfer, every rigged auction, every seizure that Rook had authorized under the color of his county badge, had been filed under the Federal Banking Statute of 1878. That statute required honest accounting as a condition of the charter's validity. The document in Harwell's hand was a preliminary notice from the Federal Banking Examiner's Office confirming that an audit had been initiated based on evidence of systematic accounting fraud, and that the charter's validity was now suspended pending review. Suspended, not revoked, not yet. But suspended meant that every transfer the corporation had made was now under federal review, which meant that every property Rook had seized and auctioned, including Ada Whitfield's ranch, was frozen. Not hers yet, not anyone's. Frozen, in a state of legal limbo that only a federal commissioner could resolve, and the federal commissioner would resolve it, based on the evidence in the ledger and the examiner's findings, which meant that the resolution would not favor the man with the silver star. "This changes things," Harwell said. "Yes, it does." The marshal folded both documents, the ledger and the federal notice, and placed them inside his coat, in the same pocket that held his commission. "I'll need to speak with the deputy who compiled this. Joseph Watt. He's at the sheriff's office. He'll be there now." "You know that for certain?" "I know that because he's a man who kept a ledger for 2 years while working inside the machine that made the entries. He's not going to run. He's been waiting for you." Harwell looked at the stranger one more time, not with the look a lawman gives a suspect or a citizen or even a concerned party. With the look a professional gives another professional when the work is done, and the results speak for themselves. "Walk with me," Harwell said. They walked east, 2 blocks, around the corner. The sheriff's office was a square building with a flagpole out front that flew no flag. Rook had never bothered to order one, and no one in Caldwell Flats had ever dared to point out the omission. The door was open. Inside, Sheriff Edmund Crail was sitting behind his desk, reviewing the morning's paperwork with the composed efficiency of a man whose operation runs like a watch. Cole Whitmore stood near the window, arms folded, watching the street. When Marshal Harwell walked through the door, Crail looked up. His expression did not change. He had dealt with the territorial marshal before: quarterly visits, perfunctory inspections, a handshake and a signature on a form that confirmed everything was in order. He expected the same today. "Marshal Harwell, right on schedule. Coffee?" "No." Harwell did not sit. He stood in the center of the room with his coat open and his hands at his sides, and he let the silence work for 5 full seconds before he spoke. 5 seconds is a long time when the person sitting behind the desk is watching a lawman who outranks him choose not to accept the offered chair. "Edmund Crail, I'm here to inform you that as of this morning, the Federal Banking Examiner's Office has suspended the charter of the Territorial Land and Development Corporation, pending an audit of its accounting records. All property transfers executed by that corporation within this county are now frozen under federal review." Crail's hand, which had been resting on his desk, did not move. His face did not move. But something behind his eyes adjusted, a recalculation so rapid and so private that only a man watching for it would have seen it. The stranger, standing behind Harwell's left shoulder, saw it. "On what basis?" Crail said. on the basis of a documented pattern of fraudulent seizures and rigged auctions spanning 2 years, compiled by your own deputy. Crail's eyes moved to the doorway, where Joseph Watt was now standing. Not because he had been summoned, but because he had been waiting. 2 years of waiting. He held nothing in his hands. He did not need to. His ledger was already in the marshal's coat. "Vernon," Crail said, using the wrong name. The name of the deputy he thought he controlled. Watt did not correct him. He simply looked at the man behind the desk with the quiet expression of a person who has been carrying a weight for 2 years and has just set it down on the only table that matters. "Joseph," Watt said. "My name is Joseph." The marshal looked at Crail. "Sheriff, I'm going to need your badge and your sidearm." Crail stared at him, the specific way a man stares when he is running every option through his mind and finding, for the first time in his career, that none of them laid anywhere good. His county commission, his shield, his authority, his identity for the past 12 years, was a local instrument. It could not override a federal suspension. It could not stop a territorial marshal with a commission signed by the governor. It could not unwrite 2 years of entries in a deputy's ledger or reverse a federal banking examiner's decision that had already been transmitted by wire and confirmed by writer. He looked at Whitmore. Whitmore looked at the floor. Crail unpinned his badge. He set it on the desk. The same desk where he had signed every fraudulent lien, every manufactured foreclosure, every seizure order that had fed the machine of the Territorial Land and Development Corporation for 3 years. The star lay on the wood and caught the light from the window, and for a moment it looked like what it had always been, a piece of metal that meant nothing without the integrity behind it. His sidearm followed, set beside the badge, the specific sound of leather and iron on wood that means a man's authority has ended. "Deputy Whitmore," the marshal said, turning to Cole Whitmore, "you're relieved of any county commission you hold, effective immediately. You'll remain in this building until I've completed my review." Whitmore said nothing. He did not need to. His silence was the loudest confession in the room. The stranger stepped back through the doorway. His part was done. The documents were in the right hands, the right man was wearing the right badge, and the machine that had been running Caldwell Flats for 3 years had just lost its engine. What remained was paperwork. The kind of tedious, necessary procedural work that restores what was taken. One entry at a time, one property at a time, one family at a time. That was the marshal's work now, not the stranger's. He walked to the stable. He untied his horse, the patient knot released with a single pull, the same way it always did. The way a knot releases when the man who tied it understood that tying and untying are the same skill, applied at different moments. The horse's ears, which had been fixed on the main door since the night before, finally relaxed. Something in the animal's body settled, a muscle group releasing, a breath drawn and held too long, finally exhaled. The horse knew. The horse always knew. The stranger stepped into the saddle and turned north. The stranger did not ride north. Not yet. He turned the horse east along the ridge road that ran above Caldwell Flats, and stopped where the ground fell away to the plain below. From there, the entire town was visible. The main street, the courthouse, the marshal's wagon still parked outside the sheriff's office, with 2 of Harwell's deputies standing at the door. The morning light had finally broken through the gray, casting long shadows across the rooftops, and the town, which had spent 3 years sleeping under the weight of a man with a silver star, was beginning to show signs of waking up differently. He sat the horse and watched. Below, Marshal Harwell's men were moving through Crail's office with the methodical efficiency of men who do this kind of work regularly. They were cataloging every ledger, every receipt, Every lien document and auction record and tax assessment that had passed through that office since Crail had pinned the star to his vest. The paperwork of a machine that had consumed 31 properties across the valley in 3 years, each one seized under the color of law and sold at auction to the same group of buyers for a fraction of its worth. The proceeds divided between a sheriff who liked pressed vests and an Eastern consortium that had never once set foot in the territory. It was plundering. The stranger had seen the consortium's filing. He had found it in the registry office the day before, under the territorial banking charter that Crail had helped them secure. The charter required honest accounting as a condition of its existence. Every dollar, every transaction, every property transfer recorded accurately and available for federal review. Prices, Watts, Ledger made that charter a fiction. Every entry in the deputy's careful handwriting contradicted an entry in the consortium's official filings, which meant the charter was not merely tainted, it was void. The consortium's legal right to own anything in the territory ceased to exist the moment that Ledger was read by someone with the authority to compare it to the original filing. That authority was Marshal Harwell, and Harwell was at that moment reading the first page. The stranger watched the marshal's face change from the professional neutrality of a man conducting a routine inspection to something harder and more focused. The expression of a man who has just realized the scope of what he is looking at is significantly larger than what his circuit schedule had prepared him for. Harwell did not look up from the pages. He turned them with the care of a man handling evidence that will be cited in court, his lips moving slightly as he read, and when he reached the entry that documented the seizure of Ada Whitfield's ranch, the auction that had happened less than 24 hours ago, in front of the entire town, his jaw tightened in a way that was visible even from the ridge. Below the ridge on the main street, the town was assembling. Not organized, not yet, but drawn by the particular gravity that pulls people toward the place where something they had accepted as permanent is being dismantled in real time. They stood on the boardwalks and in the street and in the doorways of shops, and they watched the deputies carry boxes of documents out of Crail's office. And some of them, the ones whose land had been taken, whose families had been driven off ranches their husbands and fathers had built from raw ground, stood closer than the others and did not move when the deputies passed. Ada Whitfield was among them. She stood at the edge of the boardwalk nearest the courthouse, holding the same ledger she had held at the auction. Her husband's record of 30 years of work on that land, the crops planted and harvested, the cattle bought and sold, the mortgage payments made in full and on time. She held it against her chest, the way she had held it the day before. But the grip was different now. Yesterday, it had been a shield. Today, it was something closer to a document, a proof of ownership that might, for the first time in months, be read by someone who had the power to honor what it said. The stranger watched her from the ridge. He did not ride down. What happened next on the main street took most of the morning. Marshal Harwell set up a temporary review station in the general store, the only building in town with a table long enough to hold the volume of documents his men had confiscated, and began the process of matching Watts' ledger entries against the consortium's official filings, one property at a time. He worked with the focused silence of a man who understands that every entry he verifies is a family that gets their life back, and every entry he cannot verify is a question that will require a territorial court to answer. By noon, 17 properties had been identified as fraudulent seizures. By mid-afternoon, the number was 23. The consortium's charter, the legal fiction that had given Crail's theft the appearance of legitimacy, was formally voided under the provisions of the territorial banking statute, which required, as a condition of existence, that every financial instrument filed under its authority be honest, complete, and available for review. The ledger in Watts' Bible had proven that none of those conditions had been met. The charter collapsed, and with it, every transaction the consortium had conducted under its authority. Cole Whitmore was arrested at the livery stable where he had gone to saddle a horse and leave town. He did not resist. The specific way his shoulders dropped when the deputies approached. Not surprise, not defiance, but the posture of a man who had known in some part of himself that the machine he served would eventually fail, and that he would be standing inside it when it did, was the closest thing to an admission of guilt the deputies would need. Sheriff Edmund Crail was found in his office, seated behind his desk, his silver star still pinned to his vest. He had not tried to run. He had not tried to hide the documents. He had sat there with the straight-backed stillness of a man who had been the law in this town for 3 years and could not quite comprehend that the law, applied correctly and from a higher authority, did not require his permission to function. Marshal Harwell removed the star himself. He did it without ceremony, without speech, in front of the deputies and the clerk and the 3 townspeople who had followed him inside. The star came off with a small sound, metal sliding against fabric, and Harwell dropped it into his coat pocket, the way one pockets a piece of evidence that will be needed later. Crail did not speak. He had not spoken since the marshal entered the office. His silence, which had always been a tool of authority, the silence that makes other men fill the space with their own fear, had become something else. It was the silence of a man whose language has been taken from him, because the only language he had ever spoken was the language of power, and the power was gone. The stranger watched from the ridge until the warrants were signed. Then he rode down. He came into town from the north, through the back road that ran past the old church, and tied his horse at the rail outside the general store, where Harwell was still working. He did not enter the store. He stood at the rail and waited. And when Ada Whitfield saw him from across the street, the man in the beige hat and the red bandana who had asked one question at the registry office and set the entire sequence of events in motion, she walked toward him with the specific purpose of a woman who has rehearsed what she wants to say and will not be deterred by the presence of a federal marshal or a crowd, or the fact that the man she is approaching has not, at any point in the last 48 hours, told her his name. She stopped 3 feet from him. She held her husband's ledger out in both hands. "I want you to take this," she said. "It belongs to you more than it does to me. You're the one who made it mean something again." The stranger looked at the ledger. He looked at her hands. Calloused, the knuckles swollen from decades of work. The kind of hands that build a thing and keep it built through weather and hardship, and the indifference of men who have never built anything themselves. He did not take it. "That ledger belongs on the mantle of the house your husband built," he said. "It was always the title. I just carried it to where someone had to read it." She held his gaze for a long moment. The specific quality of that moment. 2 people standing in a street that had been, for 3 years, the stage of someone else's cruelty, now standing in it as the stage of something else entirely, was not something either of them would have been able to describe later. It existed, then it passed. He untied his horse. The knot came loose with a single pull. The patient knot. The one he had tied the morning of the auction, when he did not know yet how long the work would take, but had known even then that it would not be quick. The horse's ears, which had been fixed on the sheriff's office since dawn, finally turned forward, toward the road, toward the open country, toward the direction of travel. The animal's body settled in a way that a rider recognizes. The muscle tension along the neck releasing, the weight shifting to the hindquarters. The subtle alignment of a creature that has been standing watch and is now ready to move. The stranger stepped into the saddle and turned north. He did not look back. He did not pause at the edge of town. The horse moved at a steady walk, not fast, not slow. The pace of a man who has completed the work he came to do. and has no reason to hurry toward anything else. The red bandana caught the afternoon light once briefly, as the road curved past the last building on the north end of town, and then the horse carried him over the rise and out of sight. What Ada Whitfield said to the empty road after he disappeared, that is not part of this story. It belongs to her. But the ledger went back to the mantel, and Marshal Harwell, working through the 23rd property file, looked up from his table at the sound of a horse leaving and said, to no one in particular, "I never did get that man's name." The clerk across from him shook her head. Neither had anyone else. The ranch was restored by sundown. The fraudulent auction was voided, the consortium's claims were dissolved, and every family in Caldwell Flats who had lost property to Crail's machine received notification, one document at a time, one entry at a time, that what had been taken would be returned. The $14, the real debt, the only legitimate lien against Ada Whitfield's property, the one that had been buried under layers of manufactured charges and inflated assessments and fraudulent auction fees, was left on the counter of the general store that evening in exact change by a man in a beige hat who did not give his name and did not stay for a receipt. He was already 2 miles north when the storekeeper found it. If this story found something in you, subscribe to Frontier Reckoning. There are more stories here. Stories where the quiet man at the back of the room already has the answer. He always does.